We will enter today into Sutras 11 to 20. One can give a commentary on these sutras from a variety of standpoints. One can give a commentary from standpoint of psychology. One can give a commentary on the standpoint of philosophy. One can also give a commentary based upon the specific processes involved in what is being said. One can also take a path of moving from essential knowledge of Patanjali to its comprehensive detailing out for various people, various groups of aspirants. What we will do today is to take a vantage point of psychoanalysis and where something from psychoanalytic standpoint can be said, and there are many areas where it cannot be said because the states of mind referred to in Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, many of them are not even admitted as possible by psychoanalysis. So where possible to bring in a psychoanalytic commentary on Yoga Sutras, we will do it. We have seen Sutras 1 to 10 and now we will see 11 to 20. Revising what we said in the first session, the book of Yoga Sutras is divided into 4 chapters, 196 aphorisms or sutras or statements, and in the first chapter, Samadhi Pada, we have 51 sutras, 51 aphorisms, 51 statements. Last time we saw statement number 1 to 10. Today we will see statement number 11 to 20. And as we know, we talked about it in the first session. The first session of the first chapter of the book Samadhi Path, it's a 4-chapter book. And the first chapter talks about definition of Samadhi and certain issues, certain fillers, certain clarifications related to the state of Samadhi. It's very important to note that Patanjali goes step by step. Most spiritual schools, most spiritual traditions, what happens is the final goal state they define as the state of Samadhi. But before that final goal state is achieved, you have a quarter achievement, you have a half achievement, you have a 3/4 achievement, and then the final state. No attention is usually paid to the quarter achievement, half achievement, and 3/4 achievement. Uh, Deliberation is done, defining is done, goal is kept only as the final state. Patanjali goes step by step. He defines what happens when you quarter achieve, what happens when you half achieve. So all these states are defined, talked about by Patanjali. And that is something very valuable, very rich, very rare and unique about Yoga Sutras, that they talk about not only the final state of yoga, but important states on the path. States of quarter achievement, half achievement, 3/4 achievement. So let us see how Patanjali defines all these states and what he says about reaching them. Patanjali starts with smruti or memory. Smruti or memory. It can also refer to the content of chitta, what we saw in the last session. So he says smriti or memory is the retention of past experiences. And it's a very important statement he makes. One way to look at it is to say it's an obvious thing. It's only a statement of the obvious. But Patanjali makes this statement in a very profound context. The first is, most of our difficulties arise from this retention, and many of our strengths also arise from this retention. Retention is a very important part of the human mind. The fact that a childhood trauma can govern us for the rest of our life is one manifestation of the power of retention. The fact that a few good experiences of childhood can help us sail through very difficult times in the adult life is another example of retention. And when Patanjali says retention, he is talking in the Indian context, not only retention of experiences of past of this life, but past of other lives also. So Patanjali, when he says memory is retention of past experiences, he means not only past of this life, but also of other lives. In that sense, he is very transpersonal. He is also very holistic, we'll see as we go along. So he starts with a statement of something very profound, that memory is a retention of the past experiences. And this is one of the important elements that does not allow us to go into the state of samadhi. And he defines samadhi as chitta vritti nirodha, which means cessation of the activities of the mind or the activities of the chitta. This word chitta is very differently defined by many different authors. I have seen some models of the mind in yoga psychology where chitta was defined as almost like the unconscious of psychoanalysis. So in that model I saw the active mind and the desiring mind were put under the name of manas. So manas there was a combination of active and desiring mind. Ahankara was ego, identification of soul with the body, separation of I and not I, and the drive for power, all four put together. And chitta there was the storehouse of past impressions, which was like the unconscious mind. I have also seen some models of the yogic schools where chitta was defined as the thinking part and manas was kept as the desiring part. So chitta there becomes the thinking part, manas becomes the desiring part, and ahankar remains as it is. And the soul, of course, is the fourth component of that model of the mind. But as the soul goes from reincarnation to reincarnation, the chitta goes along with it. Some part of the chitta goes along with it. That is one model of the mind. The second model of the mind is where chitta is seen as a unconscious, whereas the second model of the mind is seen as a thinking component of the mind. When Patanjali says chitta, he means all that is the causal part for movement in the mind, the psychological movement in the mind. So he is using thought movement and desire movement both. So his definition of chitta is separate from the two definitions we saw. He almost uses chitta as a synonym of what we would say psyche. When he says chitta vritti nirodha, which means cessation of all conscious activities in the mind. Some may include even unconscious activities in the mind. He is using the word chitta almost as a synonym of psyche. So he says, first he says that memory is retention of past experiences, both good and bad, and this includes traumatic experiences and happy experiences, and this leads to repetition and aversion, attachment and aversion, and it also leads to templates of thinking and behavior. And what we need is freedom from this memory. And when we say memory, there are two parts of it. Three parts of it: the motivational part, the affective part, and the cognitive part. We don't want a freedom from the cognitive part. I don't want to undo my learning of English language, but I definitely want to undo all the traumatic effect which is inside of me. So when we say memory, we have cognitive memory, we have affective memory, and we want to get past the affective memory. Cognitive memory devoid of the affective memory is not a problem. In fact, it is necessary to function sanely in this world. So he is slowly building up the point that memory is a very important component of the movement in the mind, the movement in the chitta. Because memory has cognitive and affective elements, and these affective elements of satisfaction or dissatisfaction can lead to attachment or aversion, and they in turn create movements in the mind. And apart from this memory, we also have fundamental motivational centers, and these fundamental motivational centers, the chakras, which keep active, through which desires are active. So the most fundamental problem is the problem of desire, and the second problem is of memory. It is desire and memory which keep going the activities in the mind or the chitta. And what we want is desire and memory to cease their action in an operational sense. So we want desire to cease its action, this compulsive action, memory to cease its affective compulsive action. So affective component of memory and desire, they have to cease for us to gain control of the chitta. And when the control is completely gained, there is no movement in the mind. It's a state of no thought, and we call it a state of samadhi. But this state of samadhi is not one. There are many states of mind where there is no thought, but it is still not all the same. State of no thought comes in many colors and flavors. There are different routes through which you enter, and there are different routes to which once you enter it leads you to. So you have ice cream of many flavors. Similarly, your state of mind where the commonality is there is no thought, but apart from it, the other variables in that state or surrounding that state, they vary. So we have a full menu of states where you may not have thought per se. And these states have been referred to as states of enlightenment by different masters. In many cases, it is true that they use different words to describe the same thing, but in many cases, it's also true that they are talking actually of different things, which have commonality of state of no thought, bliss, and high awareness, but other elements are different. In fact, in many of the cases, there is no bliss also. There is no state of no thought, but there is no bliss. It may also be a state of no thought without very heightened awareness. The awareness will be more than a normal state, but not as heightened as in some cases. So we are dealing with a range of cases where thought is absent. And when we say thought is absent, we mean conscious thought is absent. We may not know if the unconscious thought goes on or that also ceases. So it says memory is retention of past experiences, and it's very important element in the mind. Psychoanalysis cannot agree more on this. We are dealing with this all the time. Very few people have problems with the present or the future. Most people who come to psychoanalysis have a problem of the past. Then he says, control of the psyche is attained by practice and non-interest. He uses the word vairagya. This. And the word vairagya is interpreted in many ways. Some call it detachment, some call it disinterest, some call it dispassion, some call it something akin to renunciation, some call it living, some call it distancing, some call it very deep sense of disappointment and resignation, some call it transcendence, range of interpretations. I have used the word non-interest. Non-interest in the sense that you can also use the word non-entanglement, but that is a far later and more mature and developed state. At the state at which Patanjali is talking about, later on one can say I will be involved but not entangled. But at this level, Sutra 12, at this level what we are talking about is slowly developing the control, and there we start with non-interest. Later on we can go to a stage of involvement but not entanglement. That's a later stage. But at this stage, we start with non-interest. One has to move to one extreme, and often that comes after a very deep disappointment. So in the inner world, what happens is the object of desire is before us, but we are not interested in that object anymore. We are still not at a level where the desire per se can be transcended or purified. The desire activates itself. It also finds an object to which it can attach itself and specify itself and bring that object for consideration. These operations of desire are still continuing outside of our control. But once the object is brought to us for consideration, thereafter our control makes its presence felt and we are not interested in that object. We are still not at a level where we will say, even if I am not personally involved, interested in that object from a personal affective standpoint, even then I will involve with the object. That's a later part. But initially, we move generally to an extreme of non-interest. The object is unconsciously attached to by desire, brought to us for considerations, but cannot solicit our interest. So when that non-interest comes, a kind of observation starts that the desire is operating at a low level of intensity. The senses keep bringing data out of which desire chooses some element for its specific articulation. That object is brought before us for consideration, but we are not interested in that object. And this we have to practice again and again. And if we do it, what we have is object in front of us, but does not solicit our affective interest, our positive affective interest, nor does it create strong negative affect in us. So then this trait of non-interest, where the operations of the mind are happening, but slowly we are gaining control of this compulsive automatic functioning of the psyche. Usually we would not even know, and we would get overwhelmed by our desire for the object and start thinking and action to satisfy our desire. But now, because of working on oneself, and this working involves a lot of observation, lot of understanding, closing of the split, because that's very important to give up the interest. You can't give up interest in an all good object if the split is open. So from a psychoanalytic standpoint, somehow the split has to be closed. The dazzle and splendor of the all good object has to go. A profound understanding of the depressive position about the object has to happen. Our own stand towards the object in the light of our own idea of a good life has to be clarified to ourselves. And then this non-interest can take place. This non-interest can also take place if one is practicing something like Vipassana, where one just goes into what Krishnamurti would call a choiceless self-awareness without any profound intellectual inquiry into the object or our desire. One just goes into a choiceless self-awareness that can also lead over a period of time to this non-interest. So slowly he is talking about attaining by practice and non-interest. This non-interest has to be practiced to attain the control of the chitta. So this control means the ceaseless compulsive activities of the chitta or the psyche, they are reducing now. They are no longer as intense and with such frequency as they used to be in ordinary course of life. They have reduced. So there are two parts here, practice and non-interest. So he says control of the psyche is slowly attained by practice and non-interest. And then he goes to define what they mean. So by practice we mean two things. One is repetition of this whole experience of non-interest. And second, putting into action other elements which also help us to control the chitta. So he says in the 13th sutra, practice is that which enables maintenance and deepening of the state of control. So this non-interest and anything else that can help you. Now this is something very different from psychoanalysis, because this practice may involve meditation, it may involve mantra recitation, it may involve spiritual practices, it may involve energy practices like pranic healing or Reiki or pranayam. It may involve marma chikitsa, which is very close to acupressure. It may involve use of certain ingestible herbal substances. So this practice can be anything, but it has to be done consistently to help us maintain and deepen the state of control. And this state of control is brought about by many things. One of them is non-interest. And Patanjali says, practice is firmly established only after sincere and persistent observation for a long time. So this is not something which is a sudden attainment. It calls for a long period of practice, long period of observance. So this control of the chitta is not a one-time event. It has to be practiced again and again and converted into a new normal. The default normal is no control over chitta and the mind running in all directions all the time. From there, a new normal has to be established where the mind is peaceful and it's running at very few directions at any given point in time. So Patanjali talks about practice and then he talks about the second element of non-interest. It is founded on establishment of the observer unaffected by the thirst of objects. Seen or having heard about. So objects present to our senses or objects of memory. Objects we have directly experienced or objects we have heard about. So non-interest in them is based upon taking an observer position. That when the object is presented to us, we take an observer position of a detached neutral observer who cannot be overwhelmed by this phenomena of the object appearing before us. So what Patanjali is doing in these 5 sutras is talking indirectly in a subtle way about how important memory is, and this includes good and bad experiences of the past, and how control of chitta can be attained. We are still not come into defining various states of samadhi or 3/4 samadhi or half samadhi or quarter samadhi. But here he is just creating a background context about the state of samadhi. And he says memory is a problem for control of the chitta, and control of the chitta is attained by practice and non-interest or vairagya. And the practice has to be sustained for a long time to take effect. And the new normal of a control state of the psyche is established. This non-interest is very different than what you will find in psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis tells us we are object seekers, and non-interest in objects is not really healthy. But here Patanjali says something different, that it's not ordinary man's non-interest or a pathological non-interest. It is a post-normalcy phenomenon. It is not a normal person's or abnormal person's phenomena we are talking about. It is a post-normal, supernormal state where one gains mastery over the compulsive need for objects. So we are trying to be free from desires, trying to be free from objects of desires. And this is something very different from psychoanalysis. In psychoanalysis, there is no concept of being free or trying to be free from objects. Because here we are trying both good and bad objects. In psychoanalysis, we may say being free from bad objects is desirable, but nobody would say being free from good objects also is desirable, is a state of develop, is a step of development. But here it is a step of development when you attain the capability of being free from the objects. And of course, when you are free from the objects, you have to be in a state of joyfulness and bliss, not in the state of depression and loss. So this non-interest leading us towards freedom from the objects. That freedom is not accompanied by classical phenomena of object loss, rather it is accompanied by bliss, happiness, and a sense of fulfillment. So this object freedom is very different from object loss. We should call this as object freedom and not object loss. (16 to 20). Now Patanjali slowly comes to describing the state of samadhi. Slowly he is getting into it. So he makes a general statement The state we are trying to talk about, trying to get into, is a state beyond all the gunas. It's called gunatit, beyond all the gunas. Realized with the purusha within. This purusha can be understood in many different ways actually within the Indian spiritual tradition. One definition of this purusha is the observer, which is more like what Sankhya school would talk about, the purusha, more like the observer. Not the intellectual observer, but the spiritual observer. We should not confuse the spiritual observer with intellectual observer. Both of them are different psychological entities and both of them appear in very different psychological states. So this purusha, one way to understand is to say it is the observer, as Sankhya talks about, or as Vipassana talks about. There is a second understanding of purusha, where this purusha refers to the psychic deep inside the center of the chest. That is referred to by Sri Aurobindo and the mother and many schools of Indian spirituality which involve the experience of the psychic as a part of their evolutionary program, their self-development program, let me say. And the third definition of purusha is an experience of oneness with existence, usually one reports above the head. And Sri Aurobindo uses the term central being, very different from the psychic, to refer to that experience of individuality above the head, and it can also lead to experience of oneness with existence where there is no individuality felt. So some people refer to the experience of purusha as the experience of oceanic oneness with existence. Some refer to the experience of purusha as the experience of central being, where there is individuality, although one is connected to the oceanic whole. Some people refer to this purusha as the psychic being inside, and some as the observer. And this observer situation can lead to many different states of mind where there is an observer. So there can be a state of stillness where there is observer, no thought, but no state, no feeling of bliss. Is the feeling of stillness, as though everything is calmed down into a stillness. And then there can be a feeling of the purusha as an observer, where the purusha feels only itself and nothing else, which would be the state of kaivalya. Or the purusha may enter into a nothingness or a shunya, which is the state of nirvana. So this state of purusha, where one experiences a point of consciousness, but no conscious thought, can take various forms and interpretations. What Patanjali refers to as purusha, we don't know what exactly he had in mind, but closest that I can come to is to say he is referring to the observer of the Sankhya. This is what I feel like. Maybe he had some other definition in mind, because we have seen that almost 7 definitions of purusha we have seen. One, merger with existence, oceanic experience with the existence. Second, and the loss of individuality. Second, individuality experienced as connected to the oceanic whole. Third, experience of psyche. Fourth, experience of the observer. Fifth, of the type Sankhya refers to. Fifth, the observer in the state of stillness, samta. Sixth, observer in the state of nirvana. Seventh, observer in the state of kaivalya. So all these definitions of purusha one can use. My belief is Patanjali is using Sankhya's definition of purusha as the observer inside. So now this is the state we are looking forward to, that only the observer remains and there is no other movement in the mind. The observer is in a silent mind, the state of samadhi, one of the states of samadhi. One flavor of this word called samadhi. So word samadhi is used for a variety of states, just as the word purusha is used for a variety of entities. And it's an unnecessary confusion we have created. We should be using different words for different things. Somehow human beings have this tendency of not using specific words for specific entities, and then when one word means many things, there is confusion in communication. And unnecessary effort has to be put in clarification. So this is the state beyond the three gunas. The three gunas are rajas, tamas, and sattva. And essentially what is meant by them is qualities. Qualities of qualities which are good, qualities which are neither good nor very bad, qualities which are bad. So when we say good, bad, and ugly, beyond all those qualities, so beyond gunas, you can roughly translate as beyond qualities. A state of beyond every quality. It is a state of beyond every ordinary effect, both good and bad effects. That state of samadhi is described by Patanjali in 16, that it is a state which is beyond all the gunas, all the qualities. It's a gunatit state, beyond quality states, beyond ordinary affect state, beyond the movement of the mind state. And this is realized when you realize the Purusha inside, when you can develop a sustained observer inside who is not overwhelmed by any phenomena occurring in the mind. Once you develop that sustained observer, the Purusha, a Purusha who cannot be overwhelmed by the phenomena in the mind it is observing, then one enters into a state of samadhi. So now this is the state he says we have to aim at. This is the goal state. Now he talks about how you move towards this goal state from 17. And he talks about the first station on the journey, the Sampragnata Samadhi. The Sampragnata, as he calls it, the state. Right? It is a state which is realized through spiritual contemplation, profound thought, bliss, or identifying with the deepest part of oneself, asmita. Through this, we can have a state of sampragnata. It is a state of equanimity, where you are able to see all aspects of any object and take a detached, objective, neutral stance towards the object, because we know the good and the bad parts of the object. We also know the good and the bad part in us it provokes. And one is no longer overwhelmed by affect from inside related to that object or any overwhelming feeling because of the object being considered in the mind. Consideration does not lead to overwhelming. There is still attachment and aversion. We are not above it, but we are able to intellectually, neutrally assess the object. And this is the state of sampragnata. It's almost like a quarter samadhi. In sampragnata, you still have thoughts which are going on, conscious desires which are going on. Desires generated consciously by us, absorbed by us from society. So those desires are there, thoughts are there, but they are less in number. And we are in a state of equanimity. We are in a state of objective neutrality. We are in a state of a very profound sense of vivek, discrimination. This is sampragnata. And it is got by spiritual contemplation, profound thought. Of course, we are referring to essential philosophical profound thought. We are not referring to other kinds of ordinary thoughts. Feeling of bliss and the feelings of deep sense of I-ness. This state is the state of sampragnata. Some people translate as equal, as equanimity, and equanimity of knowledge, equanimity through knowledge. So this is sampragnata, which is essentially equanimity based upon equanimity achieved through spiritual knowledge, profound thought, an intense state of ananda or intense identification with the deepest part of oneself can also bring about this state. So this is a state of equanimity brought about by profound intellectual work, profound ananda, or profound identification with oneself, deepest part of oneself. Deeper than that is the second one, asampragnata samadhi. This follows after the sampragnata is deepened enough and practiced enough. And in this state, thoughts that we have are lesser than this. In asampragnata samadhi, thoughts that we have are lesser than this. The mind is becoming more silent. There is more rest in the mind, virama. There is more pause in the mind, virama. And now the conscious part of the mind has worked itself through by and large, and it is the unconscious desires and tendencies which are going on. Rest of the mind ceases and takes rest. So now it is the unconscious which is at work. The conscious mind has been taken care of. So in the sampragnata samadhi, the conscious mind is at work. Conscious desires are at work. They have been silenced by deeper work, and now we have only the unconscious entities are moving about. Now, in 19 and 20, Patanjali talks about how this can come about, this state of asampragnata samadhi, for two kinds of beings, and this is something completely beyond psychoanalysis. He talks of people like you and me who have bodies, and people and beings who do not have a body, videha. Deha is body, we is not having it. So videha is not having a body. So these are disembodied beings. Normally we would call them spirits. Patanjali talks about how they also have to do self-work in order to slowly move towards freedom from compulsive desires, thoughts and fears, and move towards enlightenment, the goal of evolution. Imagine a spirit coming from psychoanalysis and lying down on the couch. Completely unthinkable in psychoanalysis. But Patanjali believes that spiritual beings exist who do not have bodies, and their evolution is not complete, so they also need to work on themselves just as we have to work on ourselves. So the way they can work on themselves, Patanjali lists out how they can go into asampragnata samadhi and how we can go into asampragnata samadhi. And even this asampragnata samadhi is not the final state, because the unconscious activities are still going on. We are still not free completely of desires, fears and thoughts. But it is like half samadhi. From sampragnata samadhi, which is a quarter samadhi, we get into asampragnata samadhi, which is like a half samadhi. It's a deepening of it, higher level of attainment. So how beings with and without body can go towards it? Patanjali says, for beings without a body, he talks of two types of beings. And obviously both of them are not human. So he says, for beings without a body and those immersed in nature, it can be realized by being in their true self. Because they don't have a body, so they cannot use any yogic technique or any psychedelic substance or herbal substance or any spiritual practice. Those things they cannot do. So what he talks about is that those beings which do not have a body are of two types. Those who are spirits without a body, who once had a body, and those who are completely immersed in nature. Nobody knows what this means actually, immersed in nature. One interpretation could have been that he is talking about animals who don't have a free will, but then they have a body, so they are not being referred to here. So if he says beings without a body and those immersed in nature, one interpretation some people says beings without a body who are immersed in nature, then it becomes easy to comment on this. But if you take these two separate, then we are dealing with two categories of beings. One, those without a body and those immersed in nature. Then who can be those beings who are immersed in nature? So possibly one interpretation that I have read is, rather not read, but I can make out reading to rather, is that beings who do not have a psychic being and are constituted of pure nature, be it sattvic, rajasic or tamasic, those beings who are constituted of pure nature are referred to here. And then the second difficulty comes, they can realize this asampragnata samadhi by being in their true self, which again is a problem, because in beings without a body we can still think of a psychic, but when we think of beings immersed in nature, one way to conceptualize them is to say they don't have a psychic. Then what is the true self they will reside into if they do not have a psychic? So this is one of the difficult parts of what Patanjali says. We really don't have a clear understanding of what he is trying to say. We are not able to make out the meaning. But the safest interpretation that I can think about is, for beings without a body, they can attain to this by being in their true self, which is the psychic. And those immersed in nature without a psychic, they can get into this by being in touch, not fully but partially, with the oceanic feeling, the oceanic state above, which will take them to touch existence, one oceanic existence which is above their individuality. This can be one interpretation of this, but honestly speaking, we don't really know what he exactly means. For others like you and me, who have a body, asamprakrata samadhi is preceded by sincerity, faith, high amount of energy, which is necessary for spiritual work, inner observation, self-study, study of the self, and a deeper practice of sampragnata samadhi, which is here. So you practice this for a long period of time and deepen it, and some mystical events which happen on the path. This is sincerity. This lack of sincerity in typing sincerity. So Patanjali talks about that for you and me to get into a state of asamprakrita samadhi, which is a deeper state where the conscious mind is not very active, conscious desires and fears are given up. It is the unconscious mind which is still active. And this is almost like half a samadhi. And this is reached by long observance of sincerity, faith that we will reach this state of enlightenment. It's very important. Don't have the faith, it's very difficult to walk the path. In some cases, there is a contradictory push from inside, that one part of you does not have faith, but other part of you, which is much stronger, still pushes you onto the path. I had that experience, but it's a very turbulent experience. It's better to have faith. High amount of energy. You can't do this work if you are depressed, if high amount of energy is not available. Inner observation, that is the core of the whole path, and a deep experience of sampragnata samadhi for a long time, and mystical events. This differ from person to person, but some or the other mystical events do happen on the path. Looking at psychoanalysis, because this is first, it's very difficult to understand what he's saying into itself before we bring in psychoanalysis. So if we look at these 5 sutras, we are slowly entering into first trying to define in a general way the state of samadhi, then talking about 2 stations on the way, sampragnata samadhi, which is a quarter samadhi, and asampragnata samadhi, which is a half samadhi, and how to get there. So he says the quarter samadhi can be realized by spiritual reflection, profound thought, intense feeling of bliss or ananda, and identification with deepest part of oneself, often the psychic. And asampragnata samadhi, right, happens after a deeper practice of sampragnata samadhi, but only this is not okay, not enough. Only deeper practice of sampragnata samadhi will not lead to a sampragnata samadhi. This is deeper practice of sampragnata samadhi is one of the elements. The other elements are sincerity, faith, high amount of energy, inner observation, and sampragnata samadhi, and some mystical events. All these ingredients put together create the recipe which lead you to asampragnata samadhi. How do we look at it from a psychoanalytic standpoint? First, psychoanalysis finds it difficult to believe that there can be a state of no thought. There can be a state where there are no objects, no affect, and that a healthy, ordinary man can live in that state on demand. So it is beyond psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis has not reached yet to those rare states to understand them in its own language. But Indian spirituality has been understanding it, dealing with it very deeply for thousands of years, not centuries, but thousands of years. So first part is beyond psychoanalysis. The second part is partly can be addressed by psychoanalysis. It is a very stoic state in one sense. A state of very deep depressive position, a very comprehensive depressive position, where one objectively looks at all parts of something and integrates them into one, leading to distance and objectivity and non-overwhelming of the observing ego in psychoanalytic terms. Psychoanalysis has no problem with profound thought, but does not go into vitarka or spiritual reflection. That is beyond it. Or ananda, bliss. That is also beyond it by and large. Or into psychic, or identifying some deeper part of oneself. That is also beyond it. So psychoanalysis can use this, rather uses this. But there is no definition in psychoanalysis for a quarter samadhi or half samadhi. So these are just states, nothing special is seen in those states, nothing very valuable is seen in those states, but in fact they are very valuable states. Psychoanalysis also does not have anything to say in terms of transition from sampragnata to asampragnata. Both are out of their focus, belief and reach, all the three. Beings without a body is pure psychosis. Beings completely immersed in nature is pure psychosis. So this is more like hallucination for psychoanalysis. The view of reality here is different between Patanjali and the East and psychoanalysis on the other hand. We have dealt with this difference many times before in our lectures. The view of reality and the view of human integer and the view of purpose of the psyche and purpose of life. Faith is out of question. Inner observation is fine. Mystical events are out of question for psychoanalysis. So from a psychoanalytic standpoint, one can use sincerity and inner observation for development, but these stations are completely outside the paradigm. There is a paradigmatic difference that in the path of development, as psychoanalysis understands it, these stations don't occur. But sincerity and faith are very important for Patanjali, not so much for psychoanalysis. So these goals are not psychoanalytic goals. The path is not psychoanalytic path. Of course, psychoanalytic processes are involved. And it would be very interesting to see how these spiritual practices at a deeper level involve psychoanalytic processes. And once we know that, we can enrich spirituality with psychoanalysis and psychoanalysis with spirituality. So we'll go deeper. When we say beyond the gunas, we can refer to an observing status or we can refer to an oceanic experience. We should not confuse. A state beyond quality is essentially as an oceanic state, which is a mistake many make in psychoanalysis. Then the moment you talk about state of no thought, state of no object, state of no affect, state of no quality, automatically they link it to the oceanic state. It is not necessary. An oceanic state is one possibility, but it's also possible to be in a non-oceanic state and still have no thought, no affect, no object. So slowly we are getting deeper into the concept of samadhi, which is the purpose of the first chapter. Out of 51 sutras, we have done 20 sutras. As we go deeper, we will be able to understand more about the chapter, and by the end of the chapter, we will have a fair idea what it wants to say, and then we can proceed to the second chapter of the book. So let me know if there are any questions from psychoanalytic standpoint I can address. Thank you.